Dr. Swargajyoti Gohain's research interests include borders and state, culture and politics, migration and diaspora, infrastructure, development, education, indigenous identities, and Tibetan Buddhist communities. In this video, she talks about the Himalayan region, its conceptualization and importance, the impact of border conflicts in the region, the border communities and their predicament in the Trans-Himalaya, and their connected histories and geographies. Dr. Swargajyoti Gohain is the head of the department and assistant professor, Sociology and Anthropology at Ashoka University.
Geologists, when they define the Himalayas, they would usually tell you that the Himalayas are these, mountain ranges that are span five countries: India, China, Pakistan, Nepal, Bhutan. And in India, the Himalayan region is considered to be Jammu, Kashmir, Ladakh, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Sikkim, Arunachal Pradesh, and Darjeeling, North Bengal. And if you see the location of these areas, you'll see that they are, like I said, they are distributed among 5 different countries. So they are bound to be, border areas. So the Himalayan areas are border areas because they are located in the international boundaries of 2 or more nation states. For a long time, Himalayan studies was focused on Nepal because if you look at the history of relations between China and US, there was a Cold War period during which relations were frozen, and then there was the India-China War in 1962. So all these international relations, what we call geopolitics, so these, wider international relations between different nations also affected how one could do research or get access to border areas like the Himalayan regions. That was one reason. And the other reason was, of course, due to communications and infrastructure. So the infrastructure, the communications, transport infrastructure to these areas were lacking. There weren't enough good roads, and we didn't really have good internet or mobile connectivity in these areas for a long time. And even now, of course, in many areas, we do not have this kind of connectivity still. So till the 1970s, 80s, Himalayan studies did not really take off in a way that it could have or should have because of all these different factors like geopolitics and communications and infrastructure, and that has affected also research in this area, because if you couldn't go there, then it is not possible to do ethnographic or fieldwork based research in these areas. There were a lot of studies on Nepal because Nepal had become accessible, which is also again due to the Nepali government's opening up, or at least allowing researchers to come in. Till the 1970s, it was the case. 1950s to 1960s or 70s, 80s, Nepal was the center of Himalayan studies. But after the 1980s and 1990s, 2000 especially, we have seen that cross-border cooperation has become kind of a buzzword. Regional cooperation has kind of become a buzzword for international relations, which between India and the rest of Southeast Asia and East Asia too. There is increasing effort to build cooperation, and the Nathula Pass in Sikkim was opened in 2006. So there are all these efforts going on. I have always done qualitative study in my own research. My approach has always been fieldwork based, which means that as an anthropologist, when we do fieldwork, we have to go to a particular area or a particular setting, whether it is in the city or village or any kind of geographical area. And then we spend some amount of time. It could be 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And we try to get immersed, or we try to understand the local ways of life, local customs, local practices. We try and understand how local processes are affected, or how local processes are influenced by more global, more kind of regional factors, more national factors. And we try to see all these, broader connections with whatever we're studying and the and external world. We try to also study the historical context, so I have tried to merge historical research with my fieldwork based research, which is called ethnographic research. So my work has always been towards a historical ethnographic approach, which means that I use both archival material as well as fieldwork data. I had gone to Arunachal Pradesh to conduct a survey of local opinions about the possible, reopening of cross-border roads. How do local people there think about the possibility of reopening roads? Because the Himalayas is actually a very interesting region, because it is also a region where there was a lot of, trans-border trade, or as they say, trans-Himalayan trade from Tibet through via Kashmir or Darjeeling or Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh. And so this was like a big circuit of trans-Himalayan trade, trans-border trade, which had on all these roads had actually become slightly defunct because of the souring, relations between nations. But again, there is still talk about reviving many of these border roads. And so the question about how local communities respond to such a proposal. So that was my initial foray into studying these border communities. And once I started doing fieldwork there, I also realized that the identities, the cultures, the language struggles, the struggles regarding environment, all these are very important aspects that deserves more ethnographic study, basically more ethnographic work on the border communities who live in the Himalayan region. My book, Imagine Geographies in the Indo-Tibetan Borderlands, is about the cultural politics among Tibetan Buddhist community called the Monpas. Actually, Monpa is not one. There are several communities, but they're called Monpa under this blanket and under this umbrella kind of category. My work among the Monpas showed me that these connections that I was speaking about a while ago, there are connections between Monpas and other Tibetan Buddhists of the Himalayan region, people in Bhutan, people in Ladakh, and that is now reflecting in the contemporary contemporary cultural politics of the Monpas. So you can see that there is a alliance building among the Tibetan Buddhist communities of the Himalayan border areas. And in my work, I have termed this Himalayan Buddhism. So it's a very interesting development, because the Himalaya is not just the home of Buddhism. There are several religions. There is Hinduism, there is Islam, there is Christianity. There are many indigenous religions also in the Himalayas. But in the representations and in the cultural politics that I saw unfolding, there is a development or a tendency to represent the Himalayas as Buddhist, so Himalayan Buddhism. And so I was trying to study the processes that go into the construction of such a Himalayan Buddhist identity. And from this initial research, I moved on to my other reflections on the Himalayas, and also the new project that I want to undertake, which again will try and explore all these connections that are being forged among different communities in the Himalayan region. Because although we look at the Himalayas historically, we have looked at the Himalayas from international relations point of view, studying the Himalayas as a frontier, studying the Himalayas as they were formed, or nation states that were formed from the various Himalayan regions. So we have studied all those historically. But in such studies, often what happens, or sometimes what happens, the people who live in the border areas, they get overlooked. So my point of entry was this: the border communities and their predicament, and how, as anthropologists, we may, through fieldwork, gain better understanding of the people who live in the border areas. And that has been my motivation in also continuing Himalayan studies. I feel that there is much to be learned from doing research among the border communities in the Himalayas. And the second thing, which is a very important aspect of Himalayan studies, is that nowadays it is very difficult to think about Himalayas as, isolated places, because we have, through historical study, through oral history projects, we understand that the Himalayas had never been isolated. There is a tendency to think about the Himalayas as remote areas where people go for as tourists, or people go for ecotourism, for adventure sports, or just to discover their inner spirituality. So that's how the Himalayas have been portrayed in popular culture and popular imagination. But what this kind of portrayal does is to basically blank out all those connections, Himalayan trade, trans-Himalayan pilgrimage, trans-Himalayan friendships that used to exist. So when this is blanked out, it results in this image of the Himalayas as isolated. And so I think, as anthropologists or historians or social scientists, we can actually bring out this connected histories and connected geographies aspect of the Himalayas. And that's one of the motivations because of which I continue to do research in the Himalayas.